Well, thanks. It's great to be here with you this morning, and thanks for braving the weather to get out here. I'm very excited to be here to talk with you about cover crops, because as you know, there's an amazing amount of work going on with cover crops nationally, and I have the enjoyment of getting to not only visit with farmers all across the Midwest, but meet with a lot of people nationally on cover crops. I'm going to show you today some information about what's happening with cover crops across the country, both in terms of profitability, but what also we're understanding about the changes to soil biology from cover crops, because of course this underlies the impact that these cover crops have on our profit. And I'm really excited to see that Albert Lea is making such strong strides to provide support for cover crops, from hiring Barrett to having a cover crop catalog, doing trials, and also even selling named varieties of cover crops, which is a change from several years ago when everything was just kind of variety not stated. So lots of good things happening here at Albert Lea with cover crops. So one of the things I think about when I think about profitability with cover crops is, where do they come in terms of the resources that we use on the farm? And I hear a lot of the progressive farmers using cover crops say that part of what they're trying to do with their cover crops is tap a free resource that we have available to us on our farms, which is the solar energy that's coming down. If you think about a bare field where we've got nothing growing in the winter months, we're not really taking advantage of that solar resource. And some of you have seen solar farms popping up across the Midwest to take advantage of that. Now, I know what you're thinking on a snowy day like we're going to have later today. It's not so great if the solar cells or the cover crops being covered by snow, but as I'll show you in a minute, it's not just what's happening above ground, it's also those living roots in the soil. So even if we got snow sitting on top of those cover crop plants, we've still got good things happening with those roots that are living in the soil. One of the farmers that I've enjoyed visiting with over the years about cover crops is a guy named Dan DeSutter. You may have seen some articles about him or heard him speak. Dan farms about 5,000 acres in northwest Indiana and has been transitioning in recent years to organic on his land, but uses a lot of cover crops in his corn, soybean, and wheat rotation. And one thing Dan talks about is how he's trying to rebuild the carbon in his soil, so that's a theme I'll come back to a bit. But he also talks about the importance of the roots. And so this photo of Dan with some plants that he had dug up for the cover crops, he has learned that on his farm, getting that good root system from the cover crops is even more important than the top growth. And I know as an agronomist, that's something I had to change my thinking, because we're used to looking and seeing, how much growth have we got above ground, but with cover crops, it's really the reverse. What's happening down in the soil? We may only have 6 inches of top growth, but we might have 3 or 4 feet of root growth down there in the soil. And part of that comes back to, again, the soil biology. I know a lot of you have been reading articles about how cover crop roots are important to the soil biology, but I've certainly, as we've gone through time, been learning more and more about the whole impact. So we think about the roots and the shoots having not only an impact on organic matter, but the fungi in the soil and the bacteria, and then in turn, those are feeding a whole food web that includes nematodes that are beneficial in our system, protozoa, earthworms, arthropods, and so on. And there's a very interesting exchange you've probably read about of carbohydrates from the roots of plants, whether it's a cover crop or a commodity crop, to some of these organisms, in particular the bacteria and the fungi, where they're exchanging nutrients back to the crop root in return for the cover crops providing carbohydrates. There's a farmer in Nebraska, some of you have probably heard talk or read an article about him, Keith Burns, and he talks about carbonomics. And I think that's a good way to express it, that there's a whole underground carbon economy. And one way you can look at it is these cover crops are like the food. We're going to have a nice lunch here today, but they're the food that's feeding those microbes in the soil that are doing so much for the economy of our farm. So one plug I wanted to put in is I was involved with a new soil health film that just came out a couple weeks ago, and you may have not heard about it yet. It's called Living Soil, and it was shot on farms all across the Midwest, in fact, all across the United States. And these two farmers I've just mentioned, Dan DeSutter, Keith Burns, they both play a prominent role in it, as well as Steve Groff and others from across the U.S. And this is a free film that's available to stream or download from online. Just go to livingsoil.com It's put out by the nonprofit Soil Health Institute. So I served as technical advisor on this film, and when you're snowed in later this winter or even tonight, pull that up and take a look at it. I think you'll enjoy seeing what they have to say about cover crops and the impacts on their soil health. So another free resource we get besides just the solar energy is, again, some of those organisms and thinking about earthworms. So there was a study in Iowa that showed when we don't have cover crops versus cover crops with rye, we get about 3 times as many earthworms in the soil. We also see more earthworm middens or mounds, and those are very important in terms of not only the aeration of the soil, but infiltration of rain and nutrients in the soil. And again, this is just one example, but there are many that we've seen in research. And one thing I didn't know a few years ago is that there's actually multiple species of earthworms that we have in many of our soils. So we tend to think of the night crawlers, which are the ones we see coming out on a sidewalk or driveway after a rain, or you might think of redworms that are used in composting bins, vermicomposting. But the redworms will stay up here in the leaf litter, and then you get pale gray worms that tend to go horizontally in the soil, and then the night crawlers go up and down, and they'll even pull leaf litter into the soil. So sometimes we talk about corn on corn being a challenge because of all the leaf residue. Well, if we have more earthworms out there, they'll be pulling some of those residue from the corn in. Yeah, so the question was about the impact of organic versus conventional on earthworms. And I think there probably would be an impact in some situations, but tillage is really the #1 thing, followed by having roots, living roots as much of the year as possible, because they need to feed on some of that breakdown organic matter residue. So if you've got those 2 things, reduced tillage and some sort of living residue or living roots most of the year, that'll help. But organic systems typically have that. So in general, you're going to see more earthworms in an organic system as long as it's not excessively tilled. And we'll see here in a second what happens with that. So if we look at a field like this, it's got cover crops on the left and tillage on the right. One way to think about that is, is that we've got a lot of macropores that are building from the earthworms and the cover crop roots, and that's what helps with not only aeration, but rainfall infiltration. So we want those macropores developed by the roots and the earthworm channels, and if we're coming in and doing tillage, we're disturbing those macropores. They're just being knocked out by the tillage, and then we can get any sort of tillage barrier at the bottom, whether we're plowing or doing other operations, even disking can lead to that barrier that creates root restrictions and affects rainfall infiltration. So some people talk about earthworms as soil engineers, and I think that's a very appropriate way to think about them. They're redistributing nutrients in the soil. We look along these earthworm channels. These are zones of very high fertility and biological activity. So that's another reason that the roots will gravitate towards those earthworm channels when they're developing. So something we didn't know a whole lot about in the past that we're learning more about. Well, one way, this is a diagram we came up with in my office to kind of think about the impact of cover crops, and it's kind of like, I believe, a Swiss Army knife. We think about most of our agronomic decisions. If we're putting on some type of nutrient, that's helping us in a certain way with the plant, but with a cover crop, we're getting this whole variety of impacts on our system. And part of that, of course, is the economics. But in the end, we kind of come back to soil health. Are we improving that soil health that's going to increase our resiliency for the long run, because that's going to come back and help us with our economics. So I want to kind of turn to some farmer information. One thing we did through my office is do 5 years of a national farmer survey on cover crops. You may have seen some of the information from this in some Farm Magazine articles. And we finished doing this a year ago. But we've had some very interesting observations from that. We surveyed up to about 2,000 farmers a year. One thing we saw, not surprisingly, is that cover crop acreage is really growing. So in 2012, the farmers we surveyed were planting on average just over 200 acres of cover crops, and by 2017, they were projecting to have 450 acres of cover crops, so more than doubling in that 5-year period. And we'll talk later about where we're going with cover crop acreage. We know that in 2012, we had about 10.3 million acres of cover crops in the United States based on the USDA Census of Ag. So based on a number of things, I think we're probably at around 18 million acres now, give or take a couple million acres. We probably will be crossing the 20 million acre threshold very soon. So that's pretty sizable when you think about where we were 10 years ago when we probably had less than 2 million acres of cover crops. What about yield? So this is, of course, the first part of thinking about the profitability of cover crops is the yield impact. So we've been asking farmers for 5 years in this survey about their yields, and this was the most recent cropping year that we have data on, which is 2016. And this is about 500 farmers providing yield data. So the blue bars are with cover crops, and the orangish bars are without. And you can see in each case that with the cover crop, it was a little higher. So again, about 500 farmers were providing yield data, and we asked them to give us yield data only if they had fields where they had comparable management, and comparable planting dates, comparable soils on the cover crops and no cover crops. So out of the 2,000 farmers that responded to the survey, only about 500 of them had that situation. So the yield differences are not huge. There's about a 2.3 bushel advantage in corn. There's about a 2 bushel advantage in soybeans and about 2 bushels in wheat. But these are significant. One of the things we've been doing, again, is looking at this over the whole 5 years. And it was really interesting when we first started the survey. In the drought year of 2012, we saw much larger yield increases. So that year, both corn and soybeans were around 10% yield increases following cover crops versus no cover crops. In the other years, they've been smaller, typically 2 to 3% for corn and 3 to 4% for soybeans. So let's look at that in another way by state. This is a lot of states, but if I pick out Minnesota here, it's not a big difference, about 0.6 bushel in soybean yields in 2016. In Iowa, there was about 1.5 bushel improvement following cover crops and soybeans. So it kind of varied by state. Some had a bigger impact than others. But in general, that trend was pretty often there. Now, there were individual farms where there were yield losses following cover crops or on individual fields, but overall the pattern was for increases. We went in just the last few months and looked at this more closely, and there's a lot here, so I'm just going to quickly explain it. These are regression lines, which means we're doing a statistical procedure to look at what happens. Each one of these lines is a different year, 2012 to 2016, and we're looking at what happens with yield over here on the y-axis and the number of years of cover crop use on the right. So in 1 year, there was a relatively small impact on soybean yield in this case, typically 2% or less. But then if we come over here to 5 years, then those yield increases start to be larger, between 3% up to about 10% in that drought year of 2012. And then going on 6+ years, those yield increases continue. So we were kind of seeing this early, but we wanted to look at it more closely. So again, this is 5 years of data showing a pretty consistent pattern that the longer you use cover crops, the more beneficial yield impact you see. And that's probably not a surprise to any of you that have used cover crops, but it's something that we wanted to kind of dig into the data a little more on. Which reminds me, how many of you are already using cover crops on at least some of your fields? So probably 2/3, 3/4 of you. That's great to see. Okay, so to summarize the yield impacts that we saw, because this again comes back to the economics. So based on those 5 years of survey data, we could say that after 3 years of using cover crops with soybeans, that the median yield increase was just under 4%, and it went up to a little over 5% after 5 years of using cover crops. In soybeans, it was a more modest impact, just under 2% in 3 years, and just under 4% in 5 years. But then keep in mind, in a drought year, that we saw over double that yield impact. And actually, in the driest counties where farmers were using cover crops in 2012, that yield difference was even larger. It was positive after cover crops. So we really know that they help us with resiliency, and the median values don't take into account that when we have a really dry year, they're going to pay big dividends in those years. So that's the yield picture, but what about, do these pay overall with profitability? Well, we can look at really simple things to start with, like just the cost of the seed. We know from this national survey that farmers were paying a median cost of $25 per acre. Typically, they were reporting 20 to 30, but it was anywhere from 10 to 40 overall, and I'm sure the folks at Albert Lee can tell you it really depends on how many pounds you plant and mixes you're planting and so on. And then the cost to do the seeding, if they hired it done, like having an aerial applicator or their ag retailer do it, the average of that was $12 an acre. Of course, if you do it yourself, you can probably save some money on that. But putting those two together, a median cost of $25 for seed and $12 for getting the cover crop seed planted, that's $37 an acre that we could say was from that survey data. So if we're looking at the yield impacts, well, this is challenging. Which yield number do we pick? Do we pick the year 1 number? Do we pick the year 5 number? You know, again, the yield impacts are all the way from 0 in year 1 in some cases with corn, up to 12% in a drought year. But I've tended to look at those median numbers like after 3 years, so kind of saying maybe 3 to 4, 5% yield impact. We can look at nitrogen savings. We hear a lot about if you're using a cover crop and you use it for enough years to start improving your soil, we'll talk about organic matter in a minute, maybe you can cut back on your nitrogen. And of course, if you're doing organic, the cover crop is going to be part of that nitrogen solution to begin with, but that may provide a savings depending on your nitrogen program, especially with corn. Weed management, again, this depends on whether you're doing an organic system or conventional, but you could have a savings there potentially. Really, one of the big ways to make cover crops pay, as you probably heard, is grazing. There are some amazing performance gains with cattle grazing on cover crops, easily a pound a day, if not a pound and a half a day rate of gain in grazing cover crops, especially some of the winter cereals in late fall or early spring. So that can provide a benefit of $50 an acre or more after the cost of the seed. So that's really one way to make it profitable, is that use of grazing, but not everybody can do that, of course. And then there's the incentive payments. And we know nationally that probably less than a third of our fields have incentive payments for cover crops. It's probably more like 20% actually. But we're getting an increasing amount of incentive payments available. In Missouri, where I'm at this year, there was $20 million in incentive payments for cover crops. So we were pretty high compared to some of the surrounding states. But I would bet in Minnesota, Iowa, most of those states are running $4 to $6, $7 million in incentive payments for cover crops. So if we just look at the rates available, I looked at this yesterday, and this is off of NRCS's website. Keep in mind, they change the numbers every year. So like Minnesota's rates were higher a couple of years ago. They brought them down for whatever reason. But right now they're paying, at least based on their website, $31 an acre for what they call the basic incentive payment for cover crops in Minnesota, whereas Iowa is $34 for the basic rate, and Wisconsin's quite a bit higher at $51. If you're organic in Minnesota, you get a little higher rate at $42, whereas Iowa and Wisconsin, for the basic organic rate, it's the same as conventional. Then if you plant multiple species of cover crops, you get a boost for that because your seed costs can be higher. So Minnesota, it jumps up from 31 to 38, although there didn't seem to be an extra boost for organic from what I could see. Iowa, it's a little higher at 38, and Wisconsin, 57. And then the highest rate each of those states are paying is quite a bit higher up there in the 60s in general. And that's if you're a beginning farmer or you're a limited resource farmer or minority farmer. There's a variety of folks that fall into that category, but definitely beginning farmers would be one that can get that higher rate. So don't hesitate to take advantage of those. You're not guaranteed to get that money if you apply for it, but there's probably a pretty good chance that if you apply, you'll get it. They've increasingly removed limits, like in Iowa. They last year took the limits off so that you could do as many acres as you wanted if you were within EQIP. Also, in some of our states, we have state incentive payments available for cover crops as well as the federal ones. And then the Conservation Stewardship Program is yet another NRCS program that will provide a multi-year contract that can include payments for cover crops. So a variety of ways you can get some support to help make cover crops profitable on your farm. All right, well, let's look at a little bit longer term picture. I said over time with yields that the picture is going to improve, but let's look at some other things. One of the things we're really going to see with the longer term use of cover crops, and I know any of you using this are aware of these, but is that buildup of organic matter. So I want to come back and talk more about that in a second. Interestingly, we've been seeing more people asking, well, does this improve land value? If we're improving organic matter from 3 to 4%, does that make the land more valuable? Well, so far, there's not a lot of data to suggest that's happening yet, but there's a lot of people trying to document that so that maybe that can come into pricing. Or can be an incentive that landowners can give to farmers to maybe give them a break on their rent if you're renting ground and you're improving the soil. We know that cover crops can really help with soil compaction and the soil structure, and I continue to hear a lot of farmers telling me I get into my fields earlier where I have cover crops than my neighbors are that are not using cover crops. So that's kind of the reverse of some thinking that maybe the cover crop can delay planting, and it certainly can in some years. We'll talk about planting green here also and how that fits into planting time. Soil health, this is again something we're still learning a lot about, but a big part of what's going to help us with our long-term profitability and improved yield and resiliency. You know, soil erosion used to be the primary reason we use cover crops. When I first started working with cover crops in the early 90s, that was mainly what we talked about, that we're doing this to prevent erosion. Now we talk more about soil health and soil organic matter, but you know, if we're avoiding erosion, that's helping us in terms of reducing some costs to go out and fix erosion gullies. We're getting better soil tilth, which helps with our establishment. We get better stands of our cash crops in those situations, so this is yet another long-term way. And this is really the one that I want to get you thinking the most about, is in talking to a lot of farmers from all over the country that are using cover crops, hardly any of them add cover crops and don't change anything else. And I bet many of you can attest to this too. Once you start using cover crops, you tend to change other things in your system. You probably start using a little less tillage, or you may go completely no-till if you're conventional. You may be using less nutrients. You may be using less pesticides. So all of those other management changes are really where we start to see improvements in profitability. And while that may not happen right away in year one, usually by year 3 or so, we're seeing people starting to find ways to really make cover crops help with their profitability. So one thing I would say is many of you are already using cover crops, but as you talk to your neighbors and so on, and they're skeptical, well, tell them, you know, you put on lime without knowing that it's going to pay in year one. You know, that's going to be a 2 or 3 year payoff. You need to think the same way about cover crops. So it's going to take a 2 to 3 year time period for these to start to really pay for themselves, unless maybe you're grazing in year one or some of those other things like any incentive payments. One of the things we're learning about with cover crops, I talked about the underground system, is that they're helping us in so many different ways. So this is a diagram we had done just to show in Missouri we have a lot of soybeans on soybeans. If you have soybeans, maybe they're typically rooting 30 inches deep, and you grow a cover crop like rye that we know roots more deeply than the soybeans typically do. Maybe that rye roots another 6 to 12 inches deeper than the soybeans. Well, we've learned that the crop root, the commodity root, will tend to follow those root channels from that cover crop. So they'll get down, maybe not exactly as deep as the rye, but they'll get deeper than they would have otherwise. So that's one reason we see cover crops helping in a drought year, is we're getting deeper rooting in our commodity crop. We're also getting some residue that's reducing transpiration or evaporation from the soil. So if we've got a real thick rye mulch, that's pretty obvious, but even if it's a less of a stand. And this is one of those hidden things we're just starting to understand, is what's happening with mycorrhiza. So mycorrhiza, you've been hearing about those. They, in a way, a really simple way of thinking about mycorrhiza, it's like you're getting a larger surface area in your roots. So these mycorrhiza are associating with the plant roots. They actually infect the edge of the root cells, and they're going to provide a larger area to uptake water and nutrients. And again, this is all part of that underground carbon economy, where they're trading nutrients and in some cases water for the carbohydrates that they're getting from the plant roots. So that really helps us in a drought year as well. So of course we're not tilling obviously that deep, so it will help even in a tilled situation as long as we get past whatever impermeable barrier our roots or our tillage is creating, which usually we will. So yes, it will help even in a tilled situation. So if we look at the mycorrhiza, I just want to provide a little more proof of that. This was a study done by a scientist in South Dakota. So here's some soybeans in pots. This is soybeans with no rhizobia and no mycorrhiza, so a little shorter. And then adding just mycorrhiza, you can see they're taller. Adding rhizobia, also taller. And then if you added both rhizobia and mycorrhiza, you get bigger plants than just either of those alone. And look how much bigger those are than when you don't have either of those. So that's pretty, I mean, it's a pot versus the field, but that's pretty dramatic evidence of the role that these mycorrhiza are playing in the soil. And having cover crops, they need those living roots as much of the year as possible to keep more of those mycorrhiza living. The other thing we can do is do less tillage, because tillage tends to destroy the mycorrhiza. And if you're organic, I know that's a challenge because you've got tillage to do for weed control. But if we can minimize it in some ways, we can really help with those mycorrhiza. All right, another way to think about this is the overall nutrient cycle. You know, when I was studying agronomy at University of Minnesota, it was kind of a little bit more of an input-output model. And Barrett, you probably had a little different learning about it. You know, now we're realizing it's much more of a cycle and dynamics. We've got bacteria that are fixing nitrogen. We've got bacteria that are nitrifying. We've got denitrifying bacteria. So there's all kinds of cycling going on. And the more of a healthy soil ecosystem we have, the more we keep those nutrients in the root zone. And when we don't have a healthy system, we get leaching, we get nitrates going out tile lines, the system gets leaky, we get nitrogen going off into the atmosphere. So part of creating that healthy soil ecosystem is better cycling of those nutrients in a place where we can use them in the root zone. Of course, we know that some cover crops are good at scavenging nutrients, so this is part of the profitability picture. We're putting on nutrients in some fashion, whether it's manure or whatever it may be, and those nutrients are going to, of course, in the case of nitrates, leave that root zone pretty easily unless we can scavenge them in the off-season. So we hear a lot about radishes helping with that, but most of our cover crops can help tie up some of those nutrients until the following year rather than letting them exit the root zone. Okay, I said I wanted to come back to organic matter. I hear more and more farmers today say that the primary reason they're using cover crops is either soil organic matter or soil health. And in really simple terms, we can think about if you don't have good organic matter, you've got really high bulk density, sort of like a brick would be the equivalent. And if you've got good organic matter, you've got low bulk density, high pore space, sort of like a sponge. So that's going to help us if we've got that more sponge-like soil. We're going to have more water holding capacity, which again helps us in a drought. So we're going to be feeding those soil organisms better nutrients, crop rooting. But the thing to keep in mind is that most of our Midwest soils have about half of the organic matter that they had at one time. And I'll show you some data to that effect. This is from the National Textbook on Soils by Ray Weil. It's our probably foremost national expert on soil organic matter. And he shows that since tillage started, that we're down to about half, on average, of the organic matter we had. And how do we know that? Well, we go into fence lines that have not been disturbed or native prairies around the country that have not been disturbed. And like in Missouri, where I live, the soils are inherently, right now, the crop fields are about 2%. You can go into the native prairies and they're 4, 5, 6%. So we've lost half of that organic matter, and that affects our productivity, it affects our profitability, our ability to be resilient. The good news is we can rebuild our organic matter by using cover crops and other things we're doing in our system. I know many of you are using manure that helps as well. One thing we can do is get that cover crop to grow longer, and I know that's a challenge in this area of the country, is we've got a short fall and a short spring, but you know, one way we can do that is this idea of planting green. So we asked in our survey of farmers, this was 2 years ago, how many were planting green, and about 40% were doing it on at least some of their fields, and I think it would be even higher now. So how many of you in this room have tried at least one field of planting green into the cover crop while the cover crop was still alive? How many of you have done that? About a half a dozen. So I know it's a little less common up in this area, but I think you're going to see more of that. So this is kind of this extreme example of planting green. This is soybeans being planted into rye that's about 4 or 5 feet tall. I personally have talked to many farmers that have done this successfully. However, I don't encourage a first-time user of cover crops necessarily to do this. And I would tell you as an agronomist, if you showed me that picture 10 years ago, I'd be like, you got to be kidding. You're going to go out and plant soybeans into that? But here's what we're finding, is that when you do that, first of all, you haven't created a wet mat of cover crop residue that's laying there keeping the soil from drying out. The rye is continuing to transpire, and our climatologists are telling us our springs are getting wetter in the upper Midwest, in fact, most of the Midwest, so this can be a way we can deal with that excess moisture in the spring. It's by letting the cover crop grow until we seed our cash crop. It also makes it a little easier to get our furrows opened and closed when we don't have that mat of cover crop residue because the cover crop is still standing. There's some things that seem to happen with insects and diseases that are a little bit better in this situation. The insects will keep eating the rye instead of immediately jumping onto the corn or soybean seedling, although that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it can be the reverse. But there seems to be some really positive things. Now, we've had some restrictions from crop insurance in some areas. If you're in the western part of Albert Lee's buying zone, you're probably in an area where it's a little harder to plant green with crop insurance. But in the Farm Bill, which hopefully will be passed next week, there's some new rules that will get rid of that, and we won't have to go by certain termination times. We'll just be able to do whatever makes sense for your area. So this is something that I think we're going to see more of. This shows some soybeans coming up. In this case, the rye was sprayed to kill it, but we could, of course, roll or crimp it and do that. And some of you have seen Erin Silva's research at University of Wisconsin, where she even waits a couple weeks after planting the soybeans. The soybeans have already emerged before she goes in and does the roller crimping. So I guess what I would tell you is experiment with it. You know, I wouldn't jump and put all of your fields into planting green, but try a field of it and learn a little bit about how it can work for you. One thing we saw was with weed control. We found that 60% of the farmers said their weed control was improved with planting green, so that's another reason to do it, as well as getting that extra biomass and root growth. And then we asked about soil moisture, because people get nervous with the idea of letting the cover crop grow longer. 62% of the farmers that were doing planting green said it helped with their soil moisture. 27% said that overall it was about the same, and only 11% said it was drying out their field too often. Now, that's not to say that planting green won't dry out your field. It definitely can. I always say if you've got a dry spring, by all means terminate earlier. But with a lot of our wetter springs that we're seeing, this can be part of our management strategy. Yeah, so Max said that Dr. Abby Wick from North Dakota State University gave a talk. She's another good cover crop expert in this region, and talked about variable rates of seeding rye, putting more on depending on your soil type or less in other areas. So that's another thing I think we'll see more of, is kind of more intensely managing these cover crops to fit our soil conditions. Thanks. Okay, so then what are their motivations for planting green? Again, just maximizing the benefits from the cover crop, getting better weed control. They weren't as concerned about moisture management, but we can see that being a benefit of doing it. Okay, I think for those of you yesterday, I know Abby shared her slides with me. She talked about interseeding, so I'm not going to say too much about it, other than this is just another way of getting more cover crop growth. So the planting green is kind of at the tail end of using the cover crop. Flipping it back to the planting of the cover crop, if we can go in and plant at our vegetative stage in corn and get that cover crop established early, that can be helpful. So how many of you have planted cover crops into corn while it's still vegetative? Anybody tried that in here? 3 or 4 of you. So I think we'll see more of this, especially in the northern corn belt. So this is a high clearance drill. It's called a cover crop interseeder. This was developed by Penn State University, and there's now a private company that sells these, but other people have modified their own equipment or used high clearance broadcast seeders. This is actually drilling the cover crop in between the rows, while you can also be applying a nutrient solution, or if you're conventional, you could be spraying at the same time. And this is what the cover crop might look like. I've been in quite a few fields that have had interseeding done while the corn is vegetative, and I will tell you, in every field I've been in, that's as big as the cover crop gets. So you don't have to worry about the cover crop suddenly being 2 feet tall in the middle of your corn. It's usually going to stay a few inches high. In fact, the typical thing is it'll come up within 2 or 3 weeks, maybe get to be a couple inches high, and it'll sort of go semi-dormant until the corn starts to turn color in the fall, and then it'll take off and start growing, assuming it has moisture. Now, this makes it look easy. It's not that easy, because you've got to, if you're conventional, you've got to adjust your herbicide regimes. Even if you're organic, if you've got a dry summer, that cover crop may come up and then disappear because it just runs out of moisture. So it doesn't work 100% of the time, but it can be a strategy to try. All right, I want to just kind of transition to thinking about where we're at with the types of cover crops we use. We know cereal rye is the predominant one nationally. This is based on the survey. About half of the fields of the farmers we surveyed had cereal rye on them. Now that doesn't mean it was just cereal rye. In a lot of cases it was mixes that included cereal rye. If we extrapolated to 17 million acres of cover crops, that means there was about 8 million acres of rye planted. And I'm going to come back to that because this is an opportunity for you. Mac talked about how they're selling more cover crop seed. Well, they need people to grow cover crop seed for them. So these are some opportunities here. Oats was number 2. About 26% of the acres had oats on them. And then radishes was number 3, and you can kind of go on down. Rapeseed, winter wheat, ryegrass, and so on. And of course, these varied depending on the area. In my area down in Missouri, crimson clover is by far the most popular legume. And I know up here you would have pretty much no crimson clover because it's not winter hardy in this area. So it just depends on your area. But just to give you an idea. So there's about a dozen cover crops, but one point I would leave you with, I've personally grown probably 30 different species of cover crops. And I would say we've barely begun to understand which cover crops are best for which situations. For one thing, we have very little idea which cover crops really help with our soil biology. We know certain ones are good at fixing nitrogen. We have a little bit of idea which ones kind of help with mycorrhiza, but we don't really understand that very well. And we have very little understanding of how they impact other aspects of soil biology. So just in this picture, this is sun hemp in the background. This is a farm I visited in Pennsylvania. There's faba beans in here, clover, Austrian winter peas, so just a few. But I've visited lots of trials with many different species of cover crops. Just to give you an example, here's spring oats, which is our number 2 cover crop nationally. In northeast Missouri, the spring oats don't grow nearly as much as winter oats, but the best ones are black oats. In Brazil, my understanding is their number 1 cover crop with soybeans is black oats, which is a different species of oats. But we have very little seed supply of that so far in the U.S. So Mac, here's another one for you to add to your list. And I helped get started a project to breed new varieties of black oats and other ones and get those into the domain of seed sales because we need to better tap the genetic potential that's out there. So just to kind of help you think about this from a profit standpoint, the overall size of U.S. crop acreage of cover crops is around 20 million acres. On the path that we're on, and of course trends always change, but we're on a path right now to get to 40 to 50 million acres of cover crops in the next 7 years. So that would be a doubling of where we're at now. If we just took the 40 million acre figure times an average of $25 being paid for seed, that's $1 billion industry just for cover crop seed sales. So Mac, you guys were really smart here with your company to see that this is an opportunity to be selling more cover crops to farmers. I would say from survey and census data, there's about 50,000 farmers in the U.S. using cover crops. You may feel a little isolated. I know in some counties there's just a few people doing it, but there are a lot of people nationally doing this, probably around 50,000 farmers. And I think within the next decade we'll have over 100,000 doing it based on the trends we currently have. What's driving that growth? As we learn how to better measure soil health, it's just like anything. If we test our cholesterol and we find there's a problem, we're probably going to do something about it, right? So as people are testing their soil health and see some issues, that's going to drive them to use more cover crops. It's really interesting with the big food companies. Many of them are putting pressure on their sources to let's get soybeans that are grown with cover crops. Let's get corn that is grown with cover crops. Levi's Jeans is putting pressure on their suppliers to get cotton grown with cover crops. So you've got all these big companies. Walmart is talking about that. They're doing that. So you're getting pressure throughout the supply chain for this. I just want to end from the profitability standpoint with livestock. I know not all of you have livestock, but as I look at these numbers, I just continue to be impressed with the profit potential that's there. So even if you don't have them yourself, look at working with a neighbor that maybe has some cattle or sheep and that you can rent your ground to have them come in and graze. And there's an immediate economic advantage, but it also can help your soil because the urine and manure and saliva from those livestock, we're learning really help the soil biology. So here's some intensive management grazing on an Illinois farm with cover crops. But if you think about it, our soils evolved with herbivores. whether it was buffalo or deer or whatever it was, they were out there stimulating that soil biology while they were browsing on those plants. And so our soil organisms evolved to have animals in the system. And so when we just have plants, we're missing something that those organisms were used to. So what's possible in the future? We tend to sometimes say in this region, well, again, I may be the only one in my county doing it, and I'm trying to convince you that this is growing. This is a field or a shot in Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. Somebody sent me several aerial photos, and they all looked like this. And when I first got these, I thought, well, that's winter wheat they're growing. I looked up the statistics. In that county, less than 3% of the land is winter wheat for grain harvest. These are cover crops. They have about 70% of that county, which is the most economically intense agricultural county in the country outside of California, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. 70% of that land is cover cropped in that county. In Maryland, over half the land is cover crop. Now, yes, they have more incentives, but they've also had more years of education, more years of farmer experience. So I believe we can get there in the Midwest if we all keep working at it together. And it really comes back to the living roots. We've got to have those living roots in the soil as much of the year as possible. So don't get wrapped up just in what you see above ground. It's keeping those roots in the soil that are the key thing. Even if you only have a few inches of cover crop growth, those roots in the soil that are alive make a big difference for the soil biology. And that's getting us closer to the way our soils evolved. So think about our prairies and our forests. The soil was meant to be covered. We don't have bare soil out in nature half the year like we've had in our farming systems. That's what we're kind of reteaching ourselves, that we have this need to keep that soil with living plants on it. So I'm excited to see that most of you are using cover crops, and excited that Albert Lee Seed House is making such a contribution to this area. So thanks.